We're visiting with Dr. Nader Hashemi, Assistant Professor at the Korbel School for International Studies at the University of Denver. Professor Hashemi is an expert at the intersection of religion and politics in the Middle East. Let's first talk about political changes in Egypt and how that interacts with the rest of the region.
I don't think there is going to be any immediate short-term change in Egypt's relationship with its neighbors, particularly Israel. And the reason for that is because Egypt is still undergoing a process of transition. To what, we don't know. We hope it'll be a democratic one. And so the focus of all of the members of the democratic forces, the opposition, the new president that has just been elected, the immediate focus and priority is on the internal problems that Egypt is facing, which are largely economic, but also political. And they're political in the sense that the question of Egypt's democratic transition is still unresolved because the military is still in power. So the international implications, or the regional international implications of these changes that we are seeing in Egypt, my prediction is that they have long-term consequences. No one knows when, and I think they're really very much dependent on the pace and the speed in which a democratic transition takes place. But having said that, it's important to acknowledge that the changes that we're seeing now in Egypt, if they continue and if democracy becomes entrenched, will result in qualitative changes in the regional balance of power, and particularly qualitative changes in Egypt's relationship with Israel. And I think Israel is going to have to very seriously think about the strategy that it has been pursuing with its neighbors in the region as a result of the Arab Spring. And what I mean by that is that it's fundamentally, I think, misguided to assume that it can obtain its status in the region, its security in the region, by striking these peace deals with the dictators, ignoring the wishes of the overwhelming populations of the region who have a voice, who want to be participating in public life. And for those populations of the Arab world, particularly Israel's neighbors, the most important concern and the most important issue, identity issue for them, is the plight of the Palestinians. So Israel is going to have to make a very difficult choice that if it wants to fundamentally secure its stability and its security in the region, it's going to have to reach an accommodation not with the dictators of the Arab world, but with the peoples of the Arab world, and it can only do that if it gives justice to the Palestinians. Continuing on Israel's current path will eventually lead to conflict, because if democracy entrenches itself in Egypt, and you have popular forces coming to the fore, and they're going to be demanding an independent foreign policy, one of the first things they're going to be addressing is the plight of the Palestinians next door, the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza, and that's going to undermine the current status quo, and it's going to undermine the peace deal that was struck with Anwar Sadat over 30 years ago. There was no peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. There was a peace agreement between Israel and the dictator of Egypt, the dictatorial regime in Egypt, Anwar Sadat, and then his successor Mubarak. The majority of Egyptian people had no voice, no say in that peace agreement. And so now that they are gaining a voice, it's going to upend all of these old assumptions.
What would you say are some of the Western misunderstandings about Arab Spring and what's gone on there?
I think one of the biggest, misunderstandings and misconceptions, and this applies not only to the Arab Spring, but I think to the broader sort of approach that many people in the West and the United States have toward the politics of the Middle East. That misunderstanding and that the analytical lens and the assumptions that are often brought into this conversation often presuppose that somehow Western history, the political and social and economic changes that have been taking place in the West for the last 300 or 400 years with respect to particularly religion-state relations, particularly with respect to the question of individual rights, human rights, there's an assumption that somehow, because we in the West, we in the United States, have undergone a broad series of transformations that have changed, the West from feudalism.
Over hundreds of years.
Over hundreds of years, from, going back, let's say, from the Enlightenment forward. There's an assumption, a misassumption, that somehow those changes have also taken place at the same level, at the same pace in the Arab and Islamic world. And I think that's a misassumption. In other words, with respect to the Arab Spring, there was this general misassumption, misinterpretation, completely understandable, but I think misguided in the end, that somehow the Arab world was Eastern Europe. That if you could simply overthrow the authoritarian dictatorial regime, then you would have quick and steady and smooth transitions toward liberal democracy. It's important to remember and point out that the Arab world is not the Czech Republic, it's not Poland. There's been a qualitatively different historical experience. There's qualitative differences just in terms of socioeconomic sort of status and education levels, but also in terms of the standard of living that are important, but also critically in terms of the relationship between religion and politics. The relationship between religion and politics in most Muslim majority societies has been, both in the historical period and in the modern period, the 20th century, have been qualitatively different. And that sort of, I think, is very confusing for a lot of people, because one of the big misassumptions and points of confusion is, why are these religious-based political parties and movements so popular? These are the ones that, you know, many liberal voices here in the United States don't like, we shun, we sort of wish that they'd stay in their place. But in the case of the Arab Spring, every time there's been an election, Tunisia and Egypt, you see it's not the secular, you know, liberal forces that are winning these elections. It's actually the more socially conservative, Islamic-based forces that are winning. And I think to understand that difference, one has to jettison those assumptions that we have, which are natural. We just assume that the rest of the world sort of reflects our own worldview, but that's not the case. One has to view the Middle East through the prism and through the lens of its own historical development, not through ours.
It's a different perspective.
Yeah, so I think one has to be sort of sensitive, and, you know, because there's a sense, an understandable sense that I get from a lot of my colleagues and students, a sense of frustration, you know. Why are these transitions taking so long? Why are these sort of socially conservative forces? Why this talk of Sharia law? Why these sort of, you know, outbursts of violence, etc.? And in other words, why isn't, you know, Egypt looking like Norway? Well, because Egypt is not Norway. Egypt has a very different historical experience, particularly in the 20th century, particularly as a result of sort of the failure of the post-colonial state. But also, it's important to acknowledge here, also, the problems of political development in a country like Egypt cannot be laid exclusively at the door of Egyptians. U.S. policy here over the last 30, 40 years, supporting dictatorial regimes, supporting regimes that crushed civil society, that arrested people, that tortured people, that did not allow for the development of democracy, has complicated in very serious ways. I mean, Egypt was one of the largest recipients, and still is one of the largest recipients, of U.S. foreign aid. You know, how much of that money has actually gone to promote democracy and human rights in Egypt over the last 30 years? So that's part of the equation as well that I think we shouldn't forget.
Do you see mistakes that we could be making now, or we could be making in the near term, that you would recommend that the U.S. avoid?
Broadly speaking, I think the Obama administration has been pretty good in terms of its response toward the Arab Spring, all things considered. I mean, there's room for criticism. For example, the pace of democratization in Egypt has been very slow. The military effectively still is in control, despite the fact that Mubarak is no longer there. The United States is still giving Egypt about $1.3, $1.4 billion in annual aid to the Egyptian military. That aid can be, I think, tied to democratization and human rights. Now, the administration, to its credit, has been very good in vocalizing this, but I don't think it has been very good in terms of actually insisting on these changes taking place. And you sort of saw how difficult this process of U.S. foreign policy really, standing up to the stated beliefs and the stated principles that it claims to rest on, when it came to an event that took place about half a year ago, when several American NGOs that were working in Egypt, many of the employees of those NGOs were arrested, they were put in jail, and the United States threatened that they're going to cut off aid. The Egyptian military basically stared the Obama administration down, and in the end, they actually won. So that's, I think, one criticism. The other, I think, major criticism with respect to U.S. policy toward the Arab Spring lies in the country of Bahrain. Bahrain has also been one of the countries that has experienced an Arab Spring, a lot of human rights violations, a lot of political repression ongoing, and the United States has been relatively silent. It abstained from a UN Human Rights Council resolution condemning the Bahraini government in terms of its human policy. It's resumed military aid to the Bahraini dictatorship. It's been relatively silent. Now, of course, it's been silent because Bahrain is the home of the U.S. Navy in the Persian Gulf.